Okay, so I'm going to be talking about evil software today. This isn't viruses, this isn't malware, this is the software from the brands that we know and trust and love. The Microsofts, the Facebooks, the Googles of the world. And I'm going to be arguing that these companies are intentionally screwing us with the default settings and the user interfaces that they're designing. This is not going to be a very technical talk, but hopefully it'll be interesting for you. So a little bit about me first. I'm a researcher and activist based in Washington, D.C. I do privacy and security. Mainly I interact with lawyers, and I try and bully companies into doing the right thing in the area of privacy. I'm a PhD candidate right now. I'm also a fellow at the Open Society Foundation, and until last year, I was the first ever technologist at the Federal Trade Commission, which is the US privacy regulator. In that position, I investigated companies including Twitter, and Netflix for violating consumers' privacy and or having really bad security. So some of you may know about me, or at least my work already. In 2006, I created a website that made fake boarding passes to demonstrate how bad the no-fly list was, and this led to the FBI raiding my home at 2 in the morning. And then I've done a few things since. And then this year, I actually filed a Federal Trade Commission complaint against Dropbox because they've been telling their customers that they are encrypting their data when in fact, well, I guess they are encrypting their data. The only problem is they're using the same encryption key for every user's data, which doesn't seem like a very good method. So in general, I try and get companies to do the right thing. I will ask them politely to do the right thing, and if they decide that they don't want to do that, then I will drag them through the mud. So meet Alma. Alma is going to be a character that we'll be seeing a little bit today, and this is Alma when she's a graduate student. In the late 90s, Alma wrote a really fantastic research paper called Why Johnny Can't Encrypt. And it was studying the usability issues that prevented regular consumers, regular users, not people like us, from successfully and effectively using PGP. Right, so Alma looked into the interface and found out that it turns out that the interface, at least back then, and you can see from the picture here that this is a few years old, the user interface was so bad that no one could figure out how to use it. Now this is a major problem. If we are engineers and we are designers of systems and we want users to be secure, if they can't figure out how to use it, then we've failed our jobs. And so this was really the first in a series of papers in what has now become a community focused on security and usability. But this was this was a critical work in that it really helped to focus the fault not on the user, but on the designer and on the engineer. Right, so if the interface sucks, users will make mistakes. And maybe that's fine for a piece of mapping software. But on security and privacy, we don't want the user to make mistakes. Right? We don't want the user to screw up and accidentally make phone calls without encryption. We don't want the user to accidentally screw up and have their credit card number go over the network in plain text. Right, so user interface design is important, at least when it comes to security and privacy. But defaults also matter. And when I say defaults, what I mean to do is to contrast this between, it's one thing to have an interface that's confusing to use, but it's also important to recognize that there are going to be default settings within that interface, right? When you have a checkbox, if there's two options, a yes and a no, depending on which option is selected first, that could impact the privacy and security of the user. So this is a slice of pizza. I realize that most people here are European, but this is actually what they serve for lunch in American schools. This is school pizza. You can tell it's school pizza because it's cut in a square shape and it comes from long sheets. And as you can imagine, if students eat this every day, they end up looking like this at a pretty early age. It's probably not a good idea from a public health standpoint to have students eating pizza every day, but we live in a libertarian country where people have the right to choose what they want to do, and kids have the right to pick different meal items from the menu. But we really want kids to be eating these kinds of things because this leads to an overall healthier society. And so there's been a surprising amount of really good research in the area of behavioral economics and behavioral psychology to figure out how do you get people to eat the right thing. And it turns out that what you want to do is make it easy for people to make the right choices. So there have been studies analyzing cafeteria choices, and it turns out that children are really lazy, and they will pick the food that's at eye level. right? So if the pizza is on the top shelf and the salad is at eye level, most kids will pick the salad. This actually sort of makes sense. And so there's a move to try and make it so that the default option in the cafeteria is the healthy one. That way kids can still choose pizza if they really want to, but if they just go with the defaults, they get the healthy meal. And so there's a great book that has sort of, it's one of these pop science books that makes this accessible to the average person, called Nudge, that really focuses on the importance of default settings. It talks about organ donation defaults. In some countries, you have to opt into donating an organ. In other countries, you have to opt out. In the countries where you have to opt out of organ donation, more people are signed up for organ donation. In some countries, you have to select a pension plan by default. In other countries, one is selected for you. In those countries, people save more money for their retirement. Right? This is a lot of work in this area. But there's always a default option in any system, right? Unless you want to harass the user with constant questions just to begin the process, there's always a default option. And the guys who wrote this book, the Nudge book, Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, they describe the people who pick the default options as choice architects, right? Whoever decides what checkbox will be set by default, they are a choice architect. All right, well, we're at a tech conference. We're not supposed to be talking about pizza. So how does this apply to the technology industry? Right, so in the software field, we tend to think of someone looking like this as being the choice architect, right? And in fact, in Alma's paper about why Johnny couldn't encrypt, probably the interface for PGP was designed by someone who looked a little bit like this. But in fact, in the software industry, the default settings are not picked by that guy. They're picked by that guy, the lawyer, right? The business guy. And so as a result, we end up with systems that are designed to drive sales or designed to drive a particular business line, right? And so I'm just going to show you a few examples of this. I'm sure you'll be familiar with these, right? So you buy a plane ticket, and the travel insurance is selected yes by default. Most people don't want the travel insurance, but some percentage of consumers are going to not notice this is selected, and as they're clicking next, next, next to book the airplane ticket, they're going to have signed up for something at $19.95. Right? How many consumers have tried to download Java and installed a toolbar in the process? Now, were consumers looking for the Yahoo toolbar? No, they wanted Java. They wanted Java, or they wanted the PDF reader, right? Or they wanted some other piece of software, and this crapware gets shipped along with it. And of course, whoever is providing the underlying software, in this case Sun, they're going to get a commission from Yahoo for every consumer who doesn't uncheck the Yahoo toolbar option. But let's be clear here. No consumer is going out of their way to download the Yahoo toolbar. If they were, they would go straight to Yahoo's site instead of getting it through one of these additional partner deals. Same thing goes for Adobe Reader, just shipping Google Toolbar in this case, right? These are all examples of software sort of piggybacking on the installation process and taking advantage of poor software defaults. And of course, when we go visit our family members on the holidays, we're met with things that look like this, right? This is something that happens to me every year. And it's my job as a good son to remove the dozens of toolbars from my family members' computers that they didn't want in the first place. And they don't even know how they got there. They know that they downloaded a game, or they know they downloaded some piece of software, and then suddenly this other thing shows up. They don't know how to get rid of it. They don't know where it came from. They don't even know who to blame. Right? But even though this is a little bit problematic, and even though we can joke about this, these things don't really impact the privacy and security of users. They're just annoyances. Right? But there is there's a sort of broad theme for this kind of thing, and these defaults and the stuff that comes along with the software, and there's a name for these things. They're called dark patterns. Okay? These are user interfaces that are designed to trick people. These are not bad user interfaces. It's not that the person who designed it was a summer intern who had never built a user interface before. These have been optimized for a specific use case, and that use case is to get the user to do something, probably something that the user didn't want to do. So there's actually a website that collects all these dark patterns. It's really fun to go through and read it, and the definition they have on the website for this is that dark patterns are not poor usability or design mistakes. They're carefully crafted with a solid understanding of human psychology. I mean, they do not have the user's interests in mind. Right? Default settings matter even more in security and privacy. And dark patterns in the area of security and privacy mean far more than the travel insurance that you accidentally sign up for, right? Or the toolbar that you accidentally install. So I'm going to give you sort of 3 examples to walk through this and highlight why this is a problem and why we really need to start holding these companies accountable for these. So first point, default settings and HTTPS. People have been packet sniffing for years, right? There are signs posted around this conference letting you know that the Wi-Fi network is open and in fact dangerous. As a result, it's very, very easy to sniff someone's communications on an open Wi-Fi network. Due to the HTTP authentication cookies that are used, a sniffed cookie can then later be used to hijack an account. People have been demoing this at least since 2007, but packet sniffers have existed long before that. So why is this a problem? Well, it turns out that although we know that we're using open Wi-Fi networks and we know that there's no security, most consumers don't. So this is a usability study that was conducted in 2009. Quote, despite living in a technologically sophisticated area of the US, the participants in the study were not aware that information sent over Wi-Fi could be seen by others. Most consumers don't realize the risks that they are taking when they check their email at Starbucks or when they log into Facebook from a public place. An additional study that was done a year later showed that when a website does not have the lock icon present, the HTTPS icon, users don't notice. Even though we tell consumers, look for the lock icon, when it's absent, they just don't know. Right, so this is important. Google is actually one of the better companies in this space, and ever since Gmail launched, Google offered a HTTPS option, but it was disabled by default. So we have a fairly tech-savvy audience in here, people who break into computers for a living. Anyone who was using Gmail prior to January of 2010, raise your hand and hold it up. All right, so most of the room. All right, of those who have your hand up, how many of you had turned on the SSL option? Leave your hand up if you did not have SSL turned on before January of 2010. All right, this is some people. The average user, you can put your hand down now. The average user has never heard of SSL, and the average user had never protected themselves. All right, and so as a result, we have things like the wall of sheep at DEF CON and other ways that users can have their accounts hacked into. All right, so in 2008, there was a blog post on Google's public blog in which they were defending their current position. They said that HTTPS can make your mail slower. Your computer has to do extra work to decrypt all that data, and encrypted data doesn't travel across the internet as efficiently as unencrypted data. That's why we leave the choice up to you. See, wasn't Google being kind? They were looking out for your poor computer. They didn't want to have to slow it down, burden the poor little CPU with encryption. And so Google took the position just 3 years ago that encryption was something that consumers should have to choose to enable. But of course, as I just described 3 slides before, most consumers don't even know that their information is going over the wire in unencrypted form to begin with. So how would they know to choose this thing if they don't know that they're vulnerable? Right, so prior to 2010, in the Gmail settings, HTTPS was the last of 13 options below Unicode, keyboard shortcuts, and vacation autoresponders. Right, so HTTPS was clearly a high priority configuration option for Google. In fact, there couldn't have been anything with a lower priority in Google's eyes, at least the way the interface was laid out. Remember Alma, the grad student I talked about before? She's now Google's Director of Privacy, Product, and Engineering. She's been there for several years. The woman who first wrote 15 years ago about how poor user interface designs would lead to users not being secure was responsible for the group that had this user interface. This is Alma testifying before Congress last year. That's actually Facebook's head of engineering right next to her, who told members of Congress that every Facebook employee works on privacy. A clear lie, I think. All right, so in January of 2010, Google completely flipped their policy. Right? Prior to that, they'd said that encryption was something that consumers should have to choose to enable. In January of 2010, Google said that encryption would be the default. All Gmail traffic, all Google Docs, all Google spreadsheets, calendars, it would all be encrypted by default. Consumers wouldn't have to play with an option. What happened? Why did they do this? Two things. So first, about 6 months before, 38 experts wrote a public letter to Google telling them that they needed to turn on encryption. Ron Rivest, the R and RSA, Bruce Schneier, a bunch of big name cryptographers all wrote to Eric Schmidt and said, step up and protect your users. The other thing that happened that was announced the same day that Google turned on SSL by default was that the Chinese broke into them. Now, the Chinese didn't use a lack of encryption to break in, but this seemed like a good time for Google to make the switch. All right, so what's happened since? In the year and a half since Google turned on SSL by default, a few things have happened. Firesheep. So as I said, tools have existed for at least 5 years to enable the automated hijacking of unencrypted Wi-Fi connections, but Firesheep made it easy. This was released in October of 2010. It's been downloaded 2 million times now. Well, 1.6 when I made these slides. And this really does sort of do point-and-click hijacking. Insofar as the previous tools required a command line and a little bit of tech knowledge, you don't have to be an expert to do this. In fact, you don't have to even really know how to use a computer. You literally start the Firefox plugin and double-click on someone's name and you're in their account. It doesn't get any easier than this. And so you have to ask yourself, post-Firesheep, when 2 million consumers now have a tool at their fingertips in which they can easily hack into anyone else's account, why are the other websites out there still not encrypting their data by default? So late last year, or mid last year, Google started offering an encrypted search service, and then just a few weeks ago, Google announced that they would be using this search service by default, the encrypted search, for all signed-in users, but anyone not signed in to Google still has their search terms going over the wire in an encrypted form. Some other developments that were interesting. In January of this year, the Tunisian government was caught actively hacking into Facebook accounts of its citizens. They were injecting malicious JavaScript into the stream. Now, they weren't engaged in any kind of certificate authority shenanigans because they didn't need to, because Facebook wasn't using SSL. So shortly after this happened, Facebook turned on SSL by default just for people in Tunisia. The rest of us don't have that luxury just yet. Facebook, like Google before 2010, has SSL as an opt-in option now. Consumers who wish to be protected against Firesheep have to know this option exists and have to go and seek it out and then figure out how to turn it on. In March of this year, Ashton Kutcher, the celebrity, had his Twitter account hijacked at a conference. You can see what the tweets that were sent by the person who hijacked his account. You've been punked. This account is not secure. Dude, where's my SSL? And so shortly after that, I think a week after that, Twitter announced that they too would be offering an HTTPS option for their users, but again, not enabled by default. Microsoft, in November of last year, started offering an HTTPS encryption option for Hotmail. Again, you have to choose to use it. Microsoft seems to have outdone everyone else in the industry in making this as unusable as possible. So these steps required to turn on this option. From within your Hotmail inbox, click on Options, click on More Options, click on Account Details, click on Connect with HTTPS, click on Use HTTPS automatically, and click Save. Just 6 simple clicks to protect your email from hackers. All right, so why does HTTPS remain an opt-in option at many of these services? Do they really expect that millions of consumers are going to seek this out? No. They know that millions of consumers are not going to seek this out. And in fact, many of these services have publicly admitted that they're not ready to support HTTPS by default. The CPU load on their servers would be too high, they don't have enough crypto accelerators, whatever the reason that they believe is stopping them. The way they think they can both offer encryption but not be overwhelmed is to offer it on an opt-in basis. But of course, what this means is that the vast majority of their users are going to remain vulnerable to hijacking. Right? As a result, these options are hidden intentionally. Right? Facebook could very easily have a link on their front page to sign in using HTTPS, but they don't. So I think we have to ask, is this evil? In an era where anyone can break into your account on a public network without knowing really anything about technology, do these companies have a responsibility to protect their customers? And is it sufficient for them to offer an option and then just point to it and say, oh, well, if people really wanted it, they would protect themselves? Right? Is that a reasonable thing in this day and age? So my second example relates to disk encryption and software defaults. We live also in an era now where people are very concerned about data breaches and data theft. Laptops get stolen all the time. They get left in taxis. Anyone who finds them gets all your data. But these criminals are not the only threat to our data. The government is also a threat to our data. And so if you cross the border or just get stopped by the police, the government can open up your device and look through it. Solution to both of these threats, either seizure by the government or loss and access by a criminal, is disk encryption. But the situation is not so great in this area either. Microsoft very famously offers many different versions of their operating system. They have Home Premium, Professional, Ultimate. I think they even have some slimmed down version for the developing world. The unfortunate thing is that Microsoft doesn't include disk encryption for many of these versions. So you can't see this chart very well, but there's all these different features, and some are turned on and some are disabled for the different versions. The important thing is that to get the disk encryption, the BitLocker encryption software that Microsoft has created, and is in fact very good disk encryption software, you have to buy the Ultimate version of the OS. Now, if you go to a PC retailer and you buy a new laptop as a consumer, 9 times out of 10, it will come with Home Premium or Professional if you're really lucky. No computers are sold with Ultimate in the store. So what this means, of course, is that no laptops are being sold with the capability to have disk encryption. For consumers who want to use Microsoft's disk encryption software on a new PC they've purchased, they need to give Microsoft an additional $150. No one's doing this. Right, so how many consumers are going to go out and buy Ultimate? Not many. And whatever small sum of money that Microsoft is making, right, in upselling, 5 or 10,000 consumers a year to Ultimate, that's a really, really high price for the millions of consumers or hundreds of millions of consumers who are not going to get disk encryption software as a result. What about Apple? So Apple very famously only has a single version of their OS, whether you have the cheapest appliance or the most expensive laptop, and every version of Mac OS includes disk encryption, but it's not turned on by default. Right? And so you have to go into these settings, enable file vault, and again, although the distance for a consumer to go from getting a new computer to having disk encryption is much shorter on Mac OS, right? They don't have to pull out their credit card, they don't have to spend any money. It's still not enabled by default. And so I suspect the vast majority of consumer Mac users are not encrypting their data by default. This is my opportunity to actually say something nice about Google. So Google actually uses disk encryption by default for their Chrome OS operating system. Every Google Chrome OS laptop that's sold has all your data encrypted by default. The consumer doesn't have to do anything. There's no checkboxes to play with. So this is great. Your data is protected from identity thieves, from hackers, from the government, except for the fact that it's not encrypted on Google servers. So the government can just go to Google and ask for it. But it's still better than nothing. So I live in Washington, and I'm heavily involved in politics there and trying to stop my government from spying on my data and your data. And so there's a hearing early this year focused on the issue of encryption. The government, in fact, law enforcement interests would like to get backdoors in Skype and RIM and several other communication services. And so this is a fairly long but interesting quote from the then general counsel, the top lawyer at the FBI. Criminals tend to be somewhat lazy, and a lot of times they will resort to what is easy. So long as we have a solution that will get us the bulk of our targets, the bulk of criminals, the bulk of terrorists, the bulk of spies, we'll be ahead of the game. We cannot have to design individualized solutions as though they were sophisticated targets, who is self-encrypting, putting very difficult encryption algorithm on for every target we find, because not every target is not using such sophisticated communications. Now, this is not the most eloquent statement here, but really what she's trying to say is that the FBI knows that there are going to be people who are really smart and who are going to use sophisticated disk encryption tools. What they really don't want is the dumb criminals to have encryption. Right? We hear a lot right now in Brussels about privacy by design. This is a really big topic in privacy circles. Regulators in Europe really want companies to start building privacy and security solutions into their products enabled by default, which sounds like a great thing. The FBI doesn't want that. Right? So when they say criminals tend to be somewhat lazy, and a lot of times they will resort to what's easy, take out the word criminals and just replace it with consumers. All users tend to be somewhat lazy and will resort to what is easy. And so for the FBI to be successful in what they want, all consumers are going to lose out, right? Because there's not going to be some special laptop that's only sold to criminals. Right? So for the FBI to be happy, all laptops are going to not have to have encryption. All telephones are going to have their data stored in an unencrypted form. So this is going to be a debate that's going to keep going on for the next few months or year or two, as the FBI and other regulators sort of duke it out and fight over this issue. But the FBI doesn't want companies turning on encryption by default. It's not clear why Microsoft has chosen to make encryption a value-added feature for their premium suite. Do you know?
Yeah.
Oh, do you work for Microsoft?
Formerly.
Oh, please tell us.
On a TPM.
Sorry?
It has for usability purposes, it has a dependency on a TPM. There are no TPMs in consumer-grade PCs.
So the gentleman said that consumer-grade computers do not have a TPM chip, and BitLocker relies on a TPM chip. My understanding is that you can use BitLocker with a removable USB key. You don't need a TPM chip.
That goes right back to your usability point. It basically becomes impractical for a typical user.
So the gentleman is saying that it becomes impractical for the typical user. So I'd love to have this discussion over lunch, but there are certainly ways that Microsoft could provide some form of encryption functionality.
But
Yeah.
recall that Windows for many years does have individual file and folder level encryption. So that is built into Windows normally. I don't know if it's in the home edition.
It's not in the home edition. Right, so again, there is some encryption functionality, but you still have to buy a fancier version of Windows to get it. So let's talk a little bit about incentives quickly. What happens when the incentive of the software vendor and the user's incentives are not aligned? Well, in fact, what happens when your privacy and security incentives directly contradict the incentives and the business model of the company providing you the technology? So the example I like to use here relates to online tracking. There are several companies on the web that act as first parties. This is sort of a term of art in the tracking space, but first parties are the websites that you visit, that you choose to visit. These are the New York Timeses of the world, the BBCs, the Reddits. These are the websites that consumers know and trust. And then there are the third parties. These are the DoubleClicks of the world, the Atlases, which is Microsoft's behavioral tracking network, the BlueKais, the Lodomies. There are hundreds of behavioral ad networks, and these all act as third parties. And what I mean by that is the consumer is never visiting the front page of Atlas. They're never typing in the URL, the behavioral ad network, into their browser. And so the way these companies track you is by being present on a page, either via an image that's being loaded, some JavaScript, and that allows them to give your browser a cookie, right? And if you see the same ad network on multiple sites, then that ad network can track you and build a dossier on you. So this is the user interface for a cookie. I'm sure everyone in this room has seen one, but I have to include this. This is for Firefox. And so every browser has cookie settings. The browser settings vary, and the default settings in those browsers vary too. The important thing for this discussion relates to a setting about third-party cookies. So all browsers will allow consumers to differentiate cookies and in fact block just those cookies that come from third parties, from the websites that consumers are not knowingly visiting. So Apple's Safari browser, which is a WebKit browser, chooses by default to block third-party cookies. If you are using a Mac laptop or you're using an iPhone or an iPad, third parties will not be able to insert cookies into your browser by default. Now, there are tricks they can get around it by opening new windows and a few other things, but by and large, third parties don't get to drop cookies in your browser. Now, Google Chrome is also a WebKit browser, and it was forked originally from the same code base as Apple's browser. Google also has one of these settings, but Google has chosen to allow third-party cookies by default. There's no notice of this when you start the browser. This isn't an advertised feature. Now, of course, consumers can choose to go into the settings for the browser and disable this feature, or rather to block the third-party cookies, but very few do. Microsoft also has one of these settings, and Microsoft, like Google, has chosen to allow third-party cookies by default. Right, so I think it's interesting to contrast this. So an Apple user who goes into a store, someone who just wants the fanciest, most expensive laptop they can get, spends 2,000 euros, gets a laptop, they come out of the store with a browser that will, in effect, block some cookies and protect their privacy online, even though Apple isn't competing on its privacy features. Whereas a consumer who doesn't have as much money and goes into a store and buys a $300 Dell that comes with Windows, and either comes with Internet Explorer or they download Chrome, they don't get this. They don't get the benefit of these privacy features, at least by default. Well, the browser vendors are also ad networks. Google is both an ad network and a browser vendor. Microsoft is both an ad network and a browser vendor. And Mozilla, in fact, is funded almost entirely by money from an ad network. And we have some evidence to suggest that the business decisions or business interests of one unit can in fact impact the product features in another unit's products. So again, remember our friend Alma. What happens when Alma is conflicted? Right? What happens if she's the director of privacy for the whole company? Does that mean that she puts the privacy interests of Chrome users first? Or does that mean that she puts the business interests of the ad team, the division that actually makes all Google's money, first? Now, I don't know what's happened at Google. I don't know why they've chosen the defaults that they've chosen. But there's a great quote from Vint Cerf, who is one of the fathers of TCP/IP, who has this great photo. I really like his eyebrow thing. And so Vint was on a panel with me a couple of weeks ago in Nairobi, in Kenya, and he said this: "We couldn't run our system if everything in it were encrypted, because then we wouldn't know which ads to show you." This is a system that was designed around a particular business model. So the question that led to this quote was me saying that Google doesn't encrypt your data that they store in their servers, the things like Google Docs, your emails, those things. And Vint truthfully acknowledged that they could encrypt your data. And in fact, there are competing services to Google's, like Spider Oak, that is an online backup service, that do in fact encrypt your data. But Google is an ad-supported product. They offer ad-supported products, and for those to function, they need to see the contents of your data. And I think this is great. I think it's great that Vint is willing to publicly acknowledge this, but the rest of his company doesn't in many cases. So I don't know what role Alma and her colleagues have played in the product features for Chrome, but I do know what's happened at Microsoft. And so Microsoft has some really innovative features in their browser. In IE7, there was this brand new feature called in-private browsing and in-private filtering mode. And this was really, really cool, very innovative. And so what the browser feature would do is it would sort of keep track of which third parties were showing up when you browse the web. And if it saw the same third party over and over again, it realized that it was probably a tracking network, and it would start to block it. And so in the betas of the IE browser, this feature was turned on by default. And then when the product went live out to users, not only was it disabled by default, but each time you started the browser, if you wanted to use it, you had to re-enable it. That is the feature that was not persistent across browser restarts. Now, many people were really worried as to, and a little bit suspect as to why this happened, and there were rumors going around for a long time, and then finally, last year, the Wall Street Journal broke a story showing, in fact, that Microsoft's business units, the advertising side, had pulled weight and gone all the way up the executive chart and managed to force the browser team to change the product features. And so the quote from this is, in the end, the product planners lost the key part of the debate. The winners, executives who argued that giving automatic privacy to consumers would make it tougher for Microsoft to profit from selling online ads. Microsoft built its browser so that users must deliberately turn on privacy settings each time they start up the software. To me, this is evil. Right? This isn't a user interface design mistake. This isn't a summer intern who screwed up. This is a product feature dictated by lawyers and dictated by business folks, not engineers. This isn't a product feature that is designed to help users. This is, in fact, one that is designed to expose your private activities online so they can be monitored by Microsoft and other companies as you browse the web. And you wouldn't find out about this by visiting Microsoft's website, right? So the privacy policies of all these companies say that Microsoft cares and values cares about and values your privacy. Google is committed to protecting your privacy. At Google, privacy is integral to everything we do, right? All these companies have these sort of bogus statements they make, but none of them will tell you that they've engaged in what they believe is a reasonable balance of interests, right? Of your privacy and their business model. So my favorite quote from Microsoft is actually one that happened when I was working at the government. And a bunch of Microsoft lawyers came in to talk about some of their browser features. And this article had just come out maybe a few months before. And I asked them about it. And initially they said, we choose our defaults based on the functionality of the product. We got negative feedback during the beta period. And I said, really? Is that really what happened? And eventually one of the lawyers turned to me and said, Chris, we're not a charity. Right? And I respect that. But they don't tell you that on their website. They don't tell you that the browser is being given away for free so that their ad network can track you everywhere else you go. Right? It would be too obvious to have the browser tracking you. Right? That would be silly. Everyone would detect that. So instead, your browser just spews your private data everywhere you go on the web, and then they follow up, right? Like a fish following a rhino, or following another animal in the river. Anyway, the moral of the story here is that these companies are not doing things in your best interest, and which is fine. But again, they need to be upfront about that. These companies are not evil, but when their business models and your privacy conflict, only one can survive. It's like Highlander. There can be only one. And guess which one wins? Thank you. I think I have a little bit of time for questions.